On November 4, 1979, militants overran the American embassy in Tehran. They captured 66 Americans, blindfolding them and parading them before cameras. The captors demanded the United States hand over Iran's deposed Shah, who was in exile in Egypt. This was a highly volatile standoff, driven by the radical ideological force of Iran's new leadership. Publicly, President Jimmy Carter maintained a measured posture. Throughout the early days of the crisis, he firmly rejected military force and insisted on finding a peaceful diplomatic solution. But Carter was lying. Straight after the embassy was seized, he secretly ordered his commanders to draft plans for an armed rescue. Any open conflict carried enormous risks. The Soviet Union had just invaded neighboring Afghanistan, making the geopolitical board extremely fragile. Furthermore, a loud, sustained military incursion into Iran almost guaranteed the hostages would be executed. To avoid a wider war, Carter demanded a perfectly surgical operation. The military was instructed to extract the hostages cleanly, with a minimum of damage and absolutely no casualties to Iranian civilians. It was a political necessity that set an impossible standard for the soldiers on the ground. That impossible standard became Operation Eagle Claw. The plan required American forces to assemble in the Persian Gulf, one of the busiest maritime waterways on Earth, yet remain entirely unnoticed. Assault troops had to secretly fly 1,000 miles through hostile airspace, then land a massive, noisy force in the desert, remaining undetected on the outskirts of the Iranian capital. From there, soldiers had to infiltrate downtown Tehran, a dense city of over 3 million people. They were to locate the hostages, pry them from their fanatical guards, and escape through hostile streets without harming bystanders. Finally, the soldiers were to summon waiting American helicopters in the middle of the city and load the hostages. Then they had to fly 400 miles back to safety without being shot down by Iranian fighter jets or missiles. Operation Eagle Claw was structured like a Hollywood script. It demanded technological perfection, assumed every variable could be controlled, but war is inherently chaotic, and this plan possessed zero flexibility. The friction of reality began the moment the force launched. 6 C-130 transport planes and 8 heavy helicopters lifted off from the coast of Oman, disappearing into the night sky. To evade Iranian radar, the pilots were committed to absolute radio silence. Instantly, the strict rules of the plan isolated every crew. If something went wrong, they could not speak to each other. And things immediately went wrong. Crossing into Iranian territory, Chopper No. 8 developed a serious fault in its rotor gearbox. Unable to break radio silence to warn his commanders, the pilot simply gritted his teeth and kept flying. Shortly after, Chopper No. 6 suffered a damaged rotor blade and was forced to land in the craggy desert terrain. The crew from Chopper 8 saw them go down, landed alongside to pick them up, and then struggled to catch the rest of the formation. Then the environment intervened. The military briefings had missed local weather phenomena known as haboobs, massive swirling clouds of suspended sand and dust that stretched for miles. Desperate to avoid radar, the pilots had to fly at just 100 feet off the ground, right where the fog of sand was thickest. Dust choked the cockpits and coated the instruments. Blinded in the dirt, Chopper No. 5 lost its navigation systems and was forced to turn back to the aircraft carrier. Between sudden mechanical failures and environmental blindness, a third of the helicopters were gone before they even reached the staging area. The assault force was down to 6 choppers, the absolute minimum required by the plan to continue. The surviving pilots, completely exhausted, eventually touched down at their secret rendezvous point deep in the Iranian interior, a site known as Desert Base 1. They were there to meet the C-130s and refuel. But human variables immediately intruded. Just as the massive planes landed near a desert road, a bus full of Iranian civilians drove straight into sight. When the bus refused to stop, the American troops shot out its tires and radiator. They forced 44 civilian passengers, many of them women and children, out of the vehicle at gunpoint, holding them hostage on the roadside to protect the mission. Moments later, a fuel-smuggling lorry thundered down the same road and crashed right through the American checkpoints. A soldier fired an anti-tank weapon at the truck, causing a massive explosion that completely illuminated the night sky. The smugglers leaped out and vanished into the open country. On the ground, command and control completely dissolved. The sandy conditions required the aircraft to keep their engines running to prevent contamination. The deafening noise made giving orders impossible, and in the pitch dark, commanders couldn't even identify their own men. Then, Chopper Number 2 reported a severe hydraulic problem. It could not fly. The American force dropped to 5 helicopters, one below the absolute minimum required to safely lift the troops to Tehran. A highly rigid, zero-tolerance system had met the natural friction of reality. A cascade of minor disruptions, sand, a broken hose, and a passing bus, left Colonel Charlie Beckwith with only one logical choice. He aborted the mission. But calling the mission off didn't end the danger. The depleted force still had to escape. In the confusing darkness, the crews began a frantic scramble to refuel the remaining helicopters for the withdrawal. Blinded by swirling sand and exhaustion, a helicopter pilot moved to refuel and struck a waiting C-130 tanker plane. His rotor blades sliced off the cockpit canopy, and both aircraft instantly erupted in an enormous fireball. The explosion ignited rockets and ammunition, sending fire tearing across the desert in all directions. In the desperate stampede to escape the inferno, soldiers abandoned the surviving helicopters, leaving highly classified maps and equipment sitting in the sand. 8 American servicemen died in the fire. The next morning, President Carter announced the total failure of the operation to an astounded world. Soon after, Iranian officials arrived at Desert Base 1. They broadcasted stomach-churning footage on global television, holding up the charred bones of the dead airmen for the cameras. The Carter administration had designed the operation to project exact surgical dominance. Instead, it had broadcast a highly visible symbol of extreme American vulnerability. The historical record can never definitively prove what would have happened if Operation Eagle Claw had managed to reach Tehran, but the visual evidence tells its own story. The operation completely collapsed in the middle of an empty, desolate stretch of desert. If this rigid plan broke down against a passing bus and a cracked hose in nowhere, attempting the final extraction in downtown Tehran would have met the brutal reality of 3 million residents, hostile crowds, and heavily armed guards. It likely would have ended in a historic bloodbath. You cannot enforce a perfectly scripted order onto an inherently disordered environment. The failure in the desert was a tragedy, but considering the alternative, it's easy to agree with the American hostage who later looked at the evidence and said, "Thank God for the sandstorm."